Hi, this is Paul. A few weeks ago, when I was on a flight over to Europe for all of the things that I did in Europe, one of the videos that had just dropped was Chris Williamson and Konstantine Kisin. And in terms of, I think, people who are sort of people to watch in terms of what they're contributing to the kinds of questions that many of us in this corner are facing, these two are sort of up at the top of my list. And I remember listening to this conversation 2 hours and 20 minutes and thought it was an outstanding conversation. There were tons of things in it, but because of the timing of it, I obviously wasn't going to be making videos right before the German estuary meeting and the ARC conference, and then doing estuary visits and touring in England. But I never forgot it, and so I want to spend some time with it because there was a bunch of really, I think, interesting things out there. I just made the little COVID video, and, now I'm watching myself. Am I more fatigued than I usually do? I have the kind of stamina I usually do now that I'm dealing with COVID, and don't know. But it's like I got enough energy to do another video now, because who knows how I'll feel tomorrow? I have no idea. But there was a bunch of stuff in this video that I thought was really worth seeing. So let's give it a look.
One of the things that we've spoken about privately.
Now, again, it's been interesting that Chris Williamson is not sort of leading into the conversations with a short biography of people. I don't know exactly what he's doing behind the scenes or in terms of his editing, but it's like, bang, right into a meaty question to get the conversation off the ground. And also I look at because he's developed, he's been doing these videos in different spaces. That's been clear. He was in England for the ARC conference, and I believe he's moved to Texas, to Austin. So I don't know all the details, but it's just been interesting watching sort of the development of this.
That we haven't yet spoken about publicly is victimhood. And James Cantor came on the show. He's a sex researcher. He gave me this really interesting quote I wanted you to react to. Shifting from aiding victims to aiding everyone who claims victimhood has led to an awful lot of charlatanism. Shifting from doing good to looking good has led to an awful lot of virtue signaling. Their interaction is now Western culture, at least online.
Part of what really struck me, because I started re-listening to this conversation a couple of days ago, and part of what really struck me was they're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Now the Sermon on the Mount starts in Matthew 5, and it begins with his Beatitudes, which are, I've talked about them before, and you can go back in the catalog and see me treat the Beatitudes in Rough Draft for Sunday. They're really interesting Beatitudes because you can find Beatitudes in the Psalms, but these are not the kinds of Beatitudes you find in the Psalms. The kinds of Beatitudes you find in the Psalms tend to look like Psalm 1, the Beatitude that begins the whole book of the Psalms. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, who meditates on his law day and night. I've talked a lot about the fact that the Old Testament, on one hand, the Old Testament, again, is a library, and on one hand, one voice in the Old Testament is clearly sort of this is base religion. Do good things happen, sort of like karma. And there's certainly truth to that. But then again, you've got the book of Job that says it's never quite that simple. But sort of the baseline here is, blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and meditates on a day of light. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which bear its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like the chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked do not stand in judgment, nor the sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Now, that very much is in keeping with something like modern wisdom, because one of the things that's happening downstream from the meaning crisis is, of course, the search for wisdom. I could surely have to make this video about Brett Weinstein on Rubin Report. We'll see how long this takes. Maybe I'll do that today too. Make a bunch of videos so that, depending on how long I'm sort of out of things because of the silly COVID, y'all have your own little PVK fix in the stream. So Beatitudes tend to go like that. And wisdom is all about, well, I was thinking today about Huberman, who I didn't hear about. I didn't know anything about him, but figured out he was tremendously popular. And I wondered that if Huberman looked like Jerry Lewis in the 1950s, would he be popular? Because it's the embodiment of wisdom that people sort of look at and say, okay, well, if I want to be like Huberman, I should do all the things that Huberman says, and all these little tricks based on evolutionary biology and psychology to sort of maximize yourself. It's sort of this self-maximizing thing. And Beatitudes, you can find many Beatitudes in the Proverbs, and they're very much based on wisdom stuff. One of the easy ways to look for Beatitudes is just search blessed. And in just a simple computer search, Psalm 32, blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and those there is no. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who or turn aside to false god. Blessed are those who have regard for the weak. The Lord delivers them in times of trouble. The Lord protects and preserves them. They are counted among the blessed. Blessed are those. That's a little bit different of a beatitude. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, for they are forever praising you. Let's find some in the Proverbs. Blessed are those who find wisdom, who gain understanding. Blessed are those who listen to me, watching daily at my doors, waiting for the doorway. Blessings crown the head of the righteous, whose violence overwhelms the mouth of the wicked. The blessings of the Lord bring wealth. Well, it's not really a beatitude. Usually blessed are. Blessed is the one who always trembles before God, but whoever hearkens their hearts falls into trouble. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth and whose princes eat at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. So Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes in the Jesus' Beatitudes are very strange, because blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And not Jordan Peterson's redefinition of meek. Because what Jordan Peterson's redefinition of meek does is take away the strangeness of Jesus' form of Beatitudes that sort of undermines the wisdom tradition. Jesus is very much given something shocking. Oh, where was I?
What do you think? From aiding victims to aiding everyone who claims victimhood has led to an awful lot of charlatanism. Shifting from doing good to looking good has led to an awful lot of virtue signaling. Their interaction is now Western culture, at least online.
Okay. Because I wasn't really here to talk about Beatitudes. I was going to talk about chapter 6. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Now, that isn't disconnected from these strange Beatitudes. Jesus gives this. Jesus, in a sense, takes a step back from, in a very Job, there's a deep connection between Jesus and Job. In a very Job-like way, Jesus takes the step back from it and declares the sovereignty of God to undo sort of the default karmic God number oneness that everyone in the world is trying to game. And so what this quote that he plucked out really is all about is this theme in this part of the Beatitude. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and on the street, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret. Then your Father in heaven, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask it. Then he gives the Lord's Prayer. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you.
What do you think that we haven't yet spoken about publicly is victimhood? And James Cantor came on the show. He's a sex researcher. He gave me this really interesting quote I wanted you to react to. Shifting from aiding victims to aiding everyone who claims victimhood has led to an awful lot of charlatanism. Shifting from doing good to looking good has led to an awful lot of virtue signaling. Their interaction is now Western culture, at least online. What do you think about that?
I think it's true. And if you think about, I believe people respond to
So you're saying Jesus is right.
incentives. That's fundamentally the driving force of all human behavior. We respond to incentives. If you incentivize victimhood, you're going to get victims. And I think online is really the shift that happens, because the online world rewards it, and it also allows people to fake victimhood in a way that in person you can't really. Like if you see someone living in a massive house, you go, well, you may be a victim in some ways, but you're actually well taken care of here. But online, you can create any avatar you want, and that avatar can be projected onto the online space from a mansion. And that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, the fact that our opinions are more important than our deeds, and our words are scrutinized while our actions are done in private. How many people have we seen over the last few years? Ellen DeGeneres, Lizzo, who's that late night host that just got popped for apparently being Jimmy Fallon, I think, allegedly, has these people that outwardly are supposed to be champion for the underclass. Like, I'm supporting women of all sizes, or I'm supporting people that have different sexual orientations, or I do the whatever. And then you find out behind the scenes that they can't even treat a PA with dignity. I don't know. It seems to me like being someone who out front proselytizes about standing up for the underclass is almost becoming a red flag to go, I probably should scrutinize what's actually going on behind the scenes here.
When I was a stand-up comedian, in the comedy world, there's a golden rule of this. The more a comedian talks about how he's a male feminist on stage, the sleazier he is backstage. It's like a golden rule, never fails, always the same. So anyone who goes on stage and talks about how brilliant they are, they're always, always, always sleazy and evil behind the scenes. It's just how it works. And I think it's a kind of compensatory mechanism. People who are hiding a bunch of shit have to go out and then pretend to be something they're not.
Now, what's so interesting about this is, again, this is exactly what Jesus said. It reminds me of what Dallas Willard says in The Divine Conspiracy. This is what Willard says about what he hopes for the book. My hope is to gain a fresh hearing for Jesus, especially among those who believe they already understand him. In his case, quite frankly, presumed familiarity has led to unfamiliarity, unfamiliarity has led to contempt, and contempt has led to profound ignorance. Few people today find Jesus interesting as a person or vital relevance to the course of their actual lives. I don't know about few, because there's a lot of Christians who do, but he is not generally regarded as a real-life personality who deals with real-life issues, but as though to be concerned with some feathery realm other than the one we must deal with and must deal with now, and frankly, he's not taken to be a person of much ability. He is automatically seen more or less magical figure, a pawn, possibly a knight or a bishop, in some religious game who fits only within the category of dogma or law. Dogma is what you have to believe, whether you believe it or not. Law is what you must do, whether it is good for you or not. What we have to believe or do now, by contrast, is real life, bursting with interesting, frightening, and relevant things for people. Now, in fact, Jesus and his words have never belonged to categories of dogma or law, and to read them as if they did are simply to miss them. They are essentially subversive of established arrangements and ways of thinking. What is clear from the way they first entered the world, their initial effects, and how they are preserved in the New Testament writings and live on in his people. He himself describes the words as spirit and life. They invade our real world with a reality even more real than it is, which explains why human beings then and now have to protect themselves against them.
Morality sort of stands on the shoulders of this performative bullshit. Is there a solution to this? Is there a way that we can scrutinize, given that people's deeds and their actions and their words and their opinions are always going to be far apart?
I think that we are living through a digital revolution for which we're not prepared. Naturally, that's what a revolution is, right? It's a change in the paradigm of how we exist. So I think that 10, 15, 20 years from now, we will look back at the way we use social media now and be horrified by it. It'll be a little bit like, you know, tobacco companies promoting cigarettes as a healthy thing to do. And then we'll be like, whoa, this was actually causing a lot of damage. So I think the answer to this is a healthier relationship with the online world in particular. My hope is that we get past this stage and work out how to use all of that stuff better. I see it in myself, like the way...
Now, again, this is a very interesting thing. The goal of wisdom is, of course, to give you a solid place to stand that will not be, as Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount, shifting sand. It gives you a solid place to stand that whatever the changes come, they won't undo you. Now, this is in direct contradiction to how Brett Weinstein continues to characterize religion. The point that Jesus makes there, which Chris Williamson, although obviously it's not tagged and identified as being Jesus' point, which Chris Williamson finds effective and vital, is a point that Jesus' followers try to live out. Now, Jesus' followers may live them out well, they may forget them, they may live them out poorly, all of those things. But the point is that Jesus is making is that if you live out what I teach you, you will be able to deal with the changes that roll through even 2,000 years later. Now, it's not necessarily so easy all the time, because there are certain things that seem like sort of performative contradictions, because obviously I just read that thing about practicing your righteousness for men to see. When he ends the sermon at the Beatitudes, he says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And you may say, okay, well, that's sort of essence it's talking about. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, people have for a very, very long time looked at that verse and then scrolled down. They didn't scroll. Maybe they scrolled this way. Went down and said, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. And so, but this kind of opponent processing is very common in wisdom traditions. You can find them in the book of Proverbs. You can find two psalms that seem absolutely contradictory next to each other. And so it's in this opponent processing that you actually practice your relevance realization and look for your dialogos to put all those fancy Vervaeke words on display.
The way I use social media now is very different to the way I would have used it even 2 years ago.
How so?
I'm much more responsible with the way I use it, and I mean in terms of my own life, in terms of how much time I spend on there and what I do, but also in terms of the way I act on social media, because I am trying to be more responsible in what I say. You know, it's very easy, and I think especially on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, to get clicks. And I know exactly how to do that, which is dunk on somebody. And I spend less and less of my time doing that now, because I don't think that makes the world better, and I don't think it makes me better.
It's very rare on Twitter to have someone break the fourth wall and say, that was out of order. You're not allowed to say that. Everybody plays this sort of permanent game of sardonic tennis, right? Here's some blasé comment about how you suck, or some smart snipe back at what you said, and oh, I hit it back across the net with something else. No one actually says what they should say, which is, that's fucking out of order.
And then you're a prude if you do. This is why it's disincentivized. This is coming back to the point about incentives. So
now, Chris's comment there I found very interesting because on one hand we have council culture and we have a culture of moral watchdogs and prudes that are always calling other. We sort of live in a call-out culture. And so I was very surprised by what he said, and I thought, no, I don't really agree with that. And I think, again, we have a degree of opponent processing where we're sort of trying to make our way through and figure out, well, how, in fact, do we engage one another in a productive way that will lead to the outcomes we want? And what's interesting to me is that simply condemning people, and it's not, I got to watch language, not condemning, but there is a place for admonition and correction. But I think part of the things that we've seen is that Twitter is not the place for it. It doesn't really work very well because the truth is that generally speaking, admonition, verbal admonition, correction, its effectiveness is always a function of the relationship that the two people have, and more specifically, the humility of the person receiving it. You very famously, in the book of Proverbs, have Proverbs 26, 4, and 5. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. So they seem like absolutely contradictory proverbs. And wisdom is sort of figuring out how to deal with the fool. Now, the book of Proverbs has certain sort of set characters. The fool is one, the mocker is another, and the evil are different. Now, the fool and the evil person are in some ways, there can certainly be overlap in the Venn diagram, but they're not exactly the same in terms of their essence. The fool is shallow. The evil person is truly dangerous. The mocker is a different character altogether. Now, someone can be a fool and a mocker and be evil, but it's kind of hard because the fool is just sort of shallow, the mocker is insecure, and the evil person, again, is truly dangerous. And so figuring out, in fact, it's so funny because Chris sort of imagines kind of a straightforward, which actually many people do. And then often if they come to church and they'll say, well, Pastor, you should be up there, and it's usually the people that they have a problem with. You should be up there basically calling these people out. It's like, some of you have listened to this channel long enough to know that I'll usually say, oh, okay. And do you think that would be effective? Well, I think you should do it. Oh, okay. Would you like me to do that for you? And then a pause because, of course, they don't think they need to be called out on anything. Now, a wise person understands that admonition, even of their enemies, can be a blessing and a benefit because there are sides I can't see. There are sides to myself that I can't see, and so listening to even the challenge or correction of a fool, I can benefit from if I'm humble enough to listen and evaluate and respond accordingly. Here's a great line. The rich are wise in their own eyes. One who is poor and discerning sees how deluded they are. It's the truth that those who are on the bottom always know those are on the top better than those who are on the top know themselves or very much see the world. That's sort of the same idea of when I talk about hierarchies bind and blind. But the wise can take correction, the fool cannot. And so that sort of leads to what Jordan Peterson calls the Matthew principle. Those who have are given even more, and those who have not, even the little they have is taken away from them.
Social media rewards certain types of behavior and punishes others. So if you are the guy that says, maybe we shouldn't, pile on this person, if your team is doing the piling on, you're like the one who's not willing. Do you know what I mean? You're not willing to join in with stoning somebody, and that's why you're a loser. Yeah. That's the model that we operate in. So being responsible is disincentivized.
Yeah, I love this idea that an absurd ideological belief or an extreme ideological belief is a show of fealty to your own side and a threat display to the other, right? And the more absurd or extreme the belief, the more likely it is that your own side can trust you and that the other side should fear you. Do you know what I mean?
Now, this idea I heard and I thought, wow, That's super helpful. Let's listen to it again.
I mean,
we operate in. So being responsible is disincentivized.
yeah, I love this idea that an absurd ideological belief or an extreme ideological belief is a show of fealty to your own side and a threat display to the other, right? And the more absurd or extreme the belief, the more likely it is that your own side can trust you and that the other side should fear you. Do you know what I mean? That if you have to put reason and sensibility and common decency to one side in order to, like, here I am holding my hand in the air for whatever the current thing is, your own side sees you as a reliable ally and the other side sees you as a formidable foe.
It's tribal mechanics, but multiplied by 1,000.
Correct.
Because it's online.
With everyone scrutinizing you.
Yeah. And so you have...
But what's interesting is that if you go back to the first thing they talked about, it's a show online and it's a show with words. And, you know, what was funny is that, you know, the person that comes to mind is Donald Trump, because I think part of the way to understand Trump's popularity is exactly this. Now, does Trump actually live out personally the kinds of things he does? And what's interesting is if you take this second idea and you combine it with the first idea, it's super helpful. And this is where I think in many ways the fact that we are working through these screens. Now, before there were screens, there were reputation and there was name. And so the screens in many ways are just an extension of reputation and name, because your profilicity, you can create a profile that makes you look a certain way. But whether or not you actually live that out. And of course, Jesus in the relationship between Jesus and wisdom and the Sermon on the Mount is super interesting, because it's very clear that with the Beatitudes that Jesus is using, he's in many ways updating elements of the law and the prophets. So with the Sermon on the Mount, let me pull that up here. With the Sermon on the Mount, it begins with these Beatitudes. Then you have the salt and light. Then you have the fulfillment of the law, and you have this section on the law where you've heard it said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, is answerable in the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fires of hell. Therefore, if you are offering... and so there's an intensification of many of the Ten Commandments, and the Mosaic Law here talks about adultery, talks about divorce, oaths, eye for an eye, and then ends it. You've heard it said, love your enemy and love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? If you greet only your own people, what are you doing? What are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. And again, I've often made the point that when people just read that last verse, verse 48, be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect, they tend to project onto that verse the particular aspect of perfection that they have at the top of their value hierarchy. And for many people, especially many church people, it tends to be scrupulosity with respect to, let's say, law keeping. And what's interesting with Jesus is Jesus tends to undercut scrupulosity. Dallas Willard goes into this quite a bit in his book, The Divine Conspiracy. And what actually Jesus highlights here is not scrupulosity with respect to certain codes of law, but disposition to love one's enemies and love one's neighbors. That's what Jesus puts at the top of the hierarchy. And Jesus, again, will do that when he's asked, to summarize the law. And he gives an answer that people then would very much have recognized. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus tends to do that.
Have these weird pathologies, like you've got and it's not a comment on him personally, but you've got like a guy who lives in Malaysia commenting on American culture war issues and getting like millions and millions of views for his commentary and whatever. And you just go, and I see what you're doing there, but are you actually contributing to anything? Do you know what I mean? Because it's just fanning the flames of whatever is going on. And I see that as a, you know, like I say, it's a period, it's a transitionary period. I hope that we get to a point where we start to use social media in a different way. And actually, you know, this is an unpopular thing to say, but I don't envy the big tech executives because it's a really hard job. Because on the one hand, you incentivize to encourage engagement. And on the other hand, the engagement is achieved by amplifying anger and division and all of these things. So I hope we can work that out as a society. How do we move forward with social media?
What about the victimhood side of things then? You know, like it's almost like old trope to talk about snowflakes and all this sort of bullshit. It feels like, you know, 5 year ago culture warrior horse shit. But the underlying dynamic is still there.
Okay, pause.
Horse shit. But the, you know, 5 year ago culture warrior.
The hand gestures. And he's right. And it's interesting, again, the speed at which this sort of collective consciousness evolves, because we recognize that, the duplicity that someone can demonstrate over a particular ideology, the counter ideology can themselves present the same duplicity and hypocrisy. And so what we like, in fact, is something that is true.
Horse shit. But the underlying dynamic is still there, that we've got this sort of tyranny of the minority in some regards, that fragility is something to aspire toward, or at least it's something which is rewarded in a variety of different ways. What's your sort of conception and framework of this with a little bit more perspective that we've got now?
Well, I'm going to be speaking at ARC, Jordan's thing later this year, and one of the things I want to talk about is that I think everyone's embraced this now. We all now do it. I feel like those of us who've been concerned about wokeness have sort of got into that place where we are like, well, I'm a victim, I've been cancelled, I've been this and I've been that. And I think it's time actually for us to step into our power now and go, okay, well, we've created these new media organizations, we've created alliances, we've created community, we've created things. And the question really for us is now, we know what we're against, but not enough people are willing to say, what are we for exactly? And that's because it's much harder to do. But that is the mission now.
It is much harder to do. And so, again, this turn from a reactive to a constructive is excellent.
It's how do you get past woke, anti-woke into the future? And the future has to be about offering people a better alternative to that victimhood. Because it's more rewarding for the individual to see themselves in that way, I think. And this is, this is why Jordan Peterson was so successful when he broke through, because he was saying to people, take responsibility. And I think we all actually now are in a position where we have to say it to ourselves.
Yes, the right-wing snowflakeosphere that nobody really ever talks about. I'm pretty sure that you hate that even more than you hate left-wing snowflakeosphere. Like it's so, using the call out.
Again, you can watch the opponent processing at work, can't you?
Out culture to say this is something that shouldn't be happening. This is pedestalizing victimhood, so on and so forth. Whilst some people waving that exact same identity flag themselves, it's like, I don't know, man. Like, that doesn't seem like the way to go.
No, it doesn't. I understand it, though. And I think people on the right could quite credibly say that, well, they did this, and now tit for tat. Now we're using the weapons that they forged against them.
Yeah.
It's understandable. But I'm interested in how do we move forward? How do we move forward? And I think there's a hell of a lot of questions in modern society about that remain extremely unanswered.
Well, like,
where do you get meaning and purpose in your life now? In the society that has fewer and fewer children, in which young people are delaying adulthood longer and longer and longer, where do you get meaning and purpose exactly? For some people, that's online activism, but actually how fulfilling that is, I don't know. So the big questions remain unanswered, and perhaps increasingly so. Actually, I think
And again, online activism is displaying your righteousness before others, to be viewed by others, to get a reputation of a certain thing, to get put up a hierarchy. But there's a lot of question as to whether any of that activism actually does any good at all, or is it just all for show?
There could well be an argument that 80 years ago, people had way more meaning and purpose readily available to them at, just through the course of normal life, get married, have kids, whatever. Now, obviously, that wasn't universally available to everybody, etc. But I think in the modern world, actually, way more people are lost. They don't know what they're supposed to do exactly. So in the past, we had a kind of like set trajectory.
It's the meaning crisis and, well, the decline of legacy religions that offered these things.
Supposed to follow, which hurt some people because it wasn't the trajectory for them. But when you take away all trajectory, then everybody's lost. And I think a lot of people are in that position now. So and as I say, I think it's way harder to think about what the positive vision of the future is. But that, I think, is the task now. That's the mission. That's, what is it that, if you think wokeness is stupid and dangerous and harmful, which I do, well, what do you think in addition to that? What do you think beyond that? What is it that you think people ought to do? If they ought not to be victims, what ought they to think about with their lives, right? And that's a very difficult question that I have more questions than answers about, actually.
Well, it's way easier to identify problems than propose solutions, right? And you almost see this on the internet.
And it's way easier to propose solutions than to live out solutions.
That if somebody identifies a problem, it's kind of hard to criticize a criticism. It's possible, right? But it's way easier to criticize a proposal. And it's almost like a defense mechanism that people have to front load or front run, avoiding the criticism that they know will be incoming. It's the
And again, that's a super smart observation that if you don't want to get attacked, just be a critic. Just always be a critic. If you actually have to build something, well, now you're subject to criticism. And you see this all the time in churches. I eventually basically had my little rule here, which was people would come up to me because someone would do something, and everyone then would be a critic. Oh, they aren't doing it right. And I'd say, well, they're doing something. What are you doing? If you have an idea of how it should be done, do it. Don't tell others how to do it. Just do it yourself. And that's, so he who does decides.
Caveat, it's like, I'm not saying that we don't need to care about such and such, and I'm not saying that this isn't a big deal, but maybe we need to think about this thing. It's almost like a conceptual equivalent of that.
Yes. And I find myself doing that all the time.
Fortifying with caveats.
All the time, man. Because I think the other aspect of the way the communication happens online is like, if you make a statement, a generalized statement, you might say, exercise is good for you. And somebody will be like, yeah, but what if you've got a knee injury? And before you know it, like, you hate disabled people. Like, that's kind of how the conversation happens. But I think when we stop being able to make normative statements, everything else breaks down, right? We have to be able to say, for most people, most of the time, pairing up with someone of the sex that they are attracted to and building a life together is better than not doing that. We have to be able to say that without the one person who was in an abusive relationship. Well, what about me? Right? Yes, we understand you, but we're talking about the 95% of people.
And again, notice statistics. I just made that little video about COVID and statistics and narrative. And this is something that I'm watching. In mass media and mass culture, we had confidence in statistics. And those who were sort of on the wrong end of statistics, they didn't have a voice because it was mass media. Now, it's microcultures, and it's like, well, statistics aren't for me. Okay. But there's still a real world out there.
Right. And you feel free not to go along with whatever we're putting on the table. It's like if we put a menu of things on the table, you don't have to eat everything. No one is making you eat the gluten.
It's the Ricky Gervais guitar lessons thing, right?
Exactly.
I don't want guitar lessons.
Exactly. So I think we have to be able to say, all other things being equal, family is good.
Well, this is the tyranny of the minority. I fucking love that phrase. I think it's so smart to optimize for the edges of the bell curve rather than the middle. And as you said before, there is it is important to recognize that there are people who fall outside of the norms of normality and that they need some care as well. And if you didn't have that...
Again, notice statistics and the function that statistics are playing. And notice that in mass culture, everything was about what's at the center of the bell curve. And we've sort of now, with social media and the additional perspective of seeing and paying attention to the minority, well, then we sort of have the problem of the center and the fringe.
That sufficiently broad perspective view, these people would just fall through the cracks, and that's fucking shit, and nobody wants that to happen. But when you optimize for that, you actually end up, if you were to net out what happens, you end up with more suffering because you neglect all of the fucking fat bit of the middle of the distribution.
That's right. And we've stopped being able to make that point because and also I think a phrase that I came across, and I didn't come up with this, but somebody was saying to me the other day that we live in a world of trade-off denialism.
What's that mean?
Every decision has trade-offs. It has positives and negatives. And if you go, well, we should do this, and someone goes, yeah, but what about the thing that... And then you can never really acknowledge... It's like the climate catastrophe, right? No one wants to talk about the fact that many of the solutions that are being proposed would be worse than the problem. So it's like, if you say anything about how we're approaching that issue, you are denying that climate change is real, or you are denying that it's a problem, or you're denying that we should address it. No, I just think your idea of how to fix it is stupid. Right. And we've lost the ability to have that conversation as well. And I think we really need to reintroduce that. It's one of the things I talked about in my Oxford speech, which I think is why it did well, is because people went, oh, yeah, all right, because if we just do the stuff that we're being told we need to do, that's actually worse. And that sort of opened it up. I think we've totally forgotten that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. My favorite quote ever from Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, it's...
Okay. That's enough for now. Let me know what you think.